Today is Sunday, 10th November 2024, and Donald Trump has given us some insight into the future makeup of his administration, even if he's done it in what might be described as a negative way. He has published a very carefully worded statement confirming that the two neocons, Mike Pompeo and Nikki Haley, are not going to get jobs in his forthcoming administration. The wording of the statement was extraordinarily careful and had what I would say was a frankly tongue-in-cheek quality. Both Pompeo and Haley, who of course served Donald Trump in his first administration, Pompeo as CIA director and then as Secretary of State, Nikki Haley as UN ambassador. Anyway, both of them were praised. Donald Trump said what a pleasure it had been to work with both of them. And notwithstanding that, it turned out that they were not actually needed. They were not even being considered for the new administration. What, as I said, in Britain, we call damning with faint praise, or at least that was how this message came across to me. Now, I have to say, I am not surprised. Robert Barnes, with whom Alex Christoforou and I did a live stream back on Friday, a few days before the election itself, in which, by the way, I should say that Robert Barnes accurately and correctly predicted the outcome of the election. Anyway, Robert Barnes said that he was absolutely sure that Pompeo certainly and Nikki Haley obviously would not get jobs in the forthcoming administration. And I thought that was almost certainly correct, and so it has turned out. The other prominent neocon who was spoken of as a possible person obtaining a senior post in the administration, Senator Tom Cotton, has ruled himself out. Maybe he generally didn't want a post in a Trump administration, or perhaps, just possibly, he was given to understand that if he sought one, he wouldn't get it, and for that reason, he decided wisely not to seek one. In my opinion, all the recent commentary, all the recent talk, all the articles and comments and things that have appeared on various websites and news sites and in some media outlets suggesting that Pompeo and Haley were being considered for posts in the administration, the new forthcoming administration, were almost entirely, in fact, entirely, a lobbying exercise being carried out on their behalf, undoubtedly with their knowledge, in order to try to pressure Donald Trump into appointing them to senior positions. I suspect that Donald Trump never even contemplated that possibility. In the case of Nikki Haley, she's been highly critical of him and, of course, ran against him in the primaries. She tried to take the Republican nomination from him and, over the course of the election itself, said very little in Donald Trump's support. And, of course, Mike Pompeo was one of the people who was instrumental in throwing Donald Trump's foreign policy off course in the last 2 years of his first term, and who failed to support Trump over the documents case brought against Donald Trump by special counsel Jack Smith, and who's also said extremely critical things of Donald Trump in the past. So Donald Trump has no reason to appoint these people. It's interesting that they wanted to be appointed because, in spite of what I predict will be denials, in my opinion, they clearly did. It is interesting that some people in the media and no doubt, in Washington, in the various factions in Washington, were lobbying on their behalf. But as Robert Barnes said, there was never the slightest chance, in reality, that they would get appointed. So that's an important negative. The door has been slammed on the best known of the neocons of Donald Trump's first term. That doesn't mean, unfortunately, that there aren't other neocons in the woodworks still there, still hovering around Donald Trump, trying to get themselves inserted into important positions in the forthcoming Trump administration. Until we see who Donald Trump actually picks for his cabinet and for his other posts, we can't be sure, definitely, that he has broken with the neocons. But this decision to slam the door in the face of Pompeo and Haley, and for all I know, perhaps even Cotton as well, is perhaps a sign that he has, and if so, as far as I'm concerned, that would be an excellent decision. Now, that's one indication of where the Trump administration might be going. There has been something else which has appeared over the last 24 hours, about which I am not so sure. And that is an interview that was given to the BBC by someone who is described as a Trump ally or even a Trump advisor or a Trump aide. And this is Brian Lanza. And the BBC tells us that Brian Lanza worked on Donald Trump's 2024 presidential campaign, and that he's also had further connections with Donald Trump as well. And the interview, which was specifically on the question of Ukraine, was extremely interesting and very revealing indeed of Donald Trump's thinking, if it really does reflect that thinking, and if Brian Lanza, is actually as close to Donald Trump as we were initially led to believe. We're told that Brian Lanza told the BBC that if President Zelensky comes to the table and says, well, we can only have peace if we have Crimea, he shows to us that he's not serious. Crimea is gone. That was one thing that Lanza said. He's also reported to have said that when Zelensky says he will only stop this fighting, there will only be peace once Crimea is returned. We've got news from President Zelensky. Crimea is gone. And if that is your priority of getting Crimea back and having American soldiers fight to get Crimea back, you are on your own. Lanza, we're told by the BBC, expressed tremendous respect for the Ukrainian people whose hearts are made of lions, but went on to say that the US priority was peace and to stop the killing. What we're going to say to Ukraine is, you know what you see? What do you see as a realistic vision for peace? It's not a vision for winning, but it's a vision for peace. And let's start having the honest conversation. Now, if that is indeed the policy that the Trump administration is going to follow, then all I would say is that would be a very good thing as far as I'm concerned. It seems to me very, very close to what I've suggested all along the Trump policy should be, which is to basically stop further funding and further support for Ukraine. Tell the Ukrainians, if you want to negotiate, go ahead. We're fully in support of that. But if you go on taking this very hard line that you are taking, don't expect any further help from us. And one way or the other, we are not going to involve ourselves further or more deeply in the problem of Ukraine, which was not of ours, of Donald Trump's making. Now, that would be, as I said, I think consistent with what Brian Lanza has said. But does Brian Lanza really speak for Donald Trump? As I warned in many, many programs now, ever since the election result started to trickle through on Wednesday, you cannot assume that anybody who is represented in the media as speaking for Donald Trump actually does so. There are factions maneuvering and lobbying for their policies. There's all sorts of so-called peace plans being floated, none of which probably have any real connection to him, which is why they sound unrealistic. We've had two so-called peace plans, which we've discussed in detail, Alex Christoforou and myself, on the Duran. I refer to one as Neocon Plan Light, freeze the conflict and put off Ukraine's NATO membership for 20 years while going ahead and arming Ukraine to the hilt in the meantime. That's Neocon Plan Light. And Neocon Plan Heavy, the Pompeo plan, arm Ukraine to the hilt now and bluff Putin into some kind of capitulation. Well, those were so-called peace plans. They're not peace plans at all. Neither plan is going to be remotely acceptable to the Russians, especially the part of the first plan which involves deploying NATO troops, European troops, to police the peace plan in Ukraine, to act as some kind of tripwire or peacekeeping force. So those plans were floated. Many have assumed that they reflect Donald Trump's thinking. I've always been skeptical about that, and I think it's becoming increasingly clear that they don't. And as for Brian Lanza, I'd like to believe that he does actually speak for Donald Trump, and that he is indeed close to Donald Trump, and that his views are closer to Donald Trump's than those two neocon plans are. And up to a point, I do believe that his views are closer to those that Donald Trump and those closest to him actually hold. But I don't know for a fact that they do. Shortly after the BBC interview, an article appeared in Reuters which called Brian Lanza's connection, put Brian Lanza's connection with Trump into question. It said that Donald Trump's presidential transition effort said on Saturday that a Republican operative who outlined some potential contours of a US-backed peace plan in Ukraine earlier in the day was not speaking on behalf of the president-elect. Brian Lanza, a longtime Republican strategist who was a contractor on Trump's 2024 campaign, said in an interview with the BBC that Trump's administration would be asking Ukrainian President Zelensky for a realistic vision for peace. We're then told, responding to Lanza's comments, a spokesman for the transition denied that Lanza spoke for Trump. Trump's transition effort is currently vetting personnel and drafting the policies that Trump could adopt during his second term. Brian Lanza was a contractor for the campaign, said the spokesman, who declined to be named. He does not work for President Trump and does not speak for him. So we mustn't assume that Brian Lanza speaks for Donald Trump any more than those people who've been floating those other so-called peace plans, actually plans to prolong the war, do. So, for the moment, what Donald Trump intends to do about Ukraine, or indeed any other foreign policy matter, remains, well, known to himself and to a small group of people around him. Having said that, we are getting other clues, which I do think are a little bit more reliable than those things that Brian Lanza has said. I'm not, by the way, saying that Brian Lanza is not well informed and is not echoing or mirroring Trump's opinions. It's just that I don't know that he is. But we can say that others who unquestionably are close to Trump and have been close to Trump over the close course of the latest campaign, they do seem to be saying things which do give us some insight into what the possible policies of a future Trump administration might be. So Elon Musk and David Sachs, the two tech entrepreneurs, billionaires, as some people never hesitate to refer to them. Of course, that is what they are. Anyway, both of them have come forward. I should say that David Sachs is someone who we know on the Duran. He has been kind enough to join us for at least 2 programs that we have done with him, 2 live streams that we have done with him. So anyway, just to say that. Anyway, both of them have made apparently various comments, and I think I'm right in saying that in Musk's case, especially, he's called into question. He said that the gravy train with respect to Ukraine basically stops. Money has supposedly been circulating, flowing freely from Washington to Kiev and from Kiev back to Washington, and this has been going on a scale that nobody can possibly imagine, all of which, by the way, is entirely true. Alex Christoforou and I have discussed this extensively on the Duran in many, many programs going back years. Anyway, we're being led to believe that that is now going to end, and that does seem to suggest a significant shift in policy, to put it mildly. And I understand that Donald Trump Jr. has basically said the same thing, talking about Zelensky and talking about Zelensky's gloomy countenance. Donald Trump Jr. has apparently said that in 38 days' time, presumably around the time when the Electoral College confirms the election results and formally votes Donald Trump as the future president of the United States. I should say that I understand that by formal constitutional law, Donald Trump is elected president of the United States by the Electoral College. What we have just seen happen in the United States is an election, or rather a series of elections, to elect the electors who will be appointed to the Electoral College. It is the Electoral College which is the legal election, which has not yet happened. Anyway, I presume when he talks about 38 days from now, that is what Donald Trump Jr. is referring to. Anyway, according to Donald Trump Jr., once those 38 days are up, well, the money to Zelensky will basically stop. And again, one must assume, I do presume, that Donald Trump Jr. is very close to Donald Trump himself. He is, after all, Donald Trump's son. He's been a major figure both in the first Trump administration and since then. He's been a very, very loyal and, by the way, very effective supporter politically of his father. And I must assume that Donald Trump Jr. Here is expressing Donald Trump's thinking. So all of that does perhaps point to a change of policy, a policy change whereby once Donald Trump is inaugurated president, further military support for Ukraine basically comes to an end. as I said, we're not quite at that point yet. And of course, the inauguration is still 2 months away, and we don't yet have the complete team of people who are going to be appointed to it. So we can't be absolutely sure at this point that that is how it's going to be. But the indications so far clearly point in that direction. These comments from Elon Musk, David Sachs, Donald Trump Jr., and perhaps Brian Lanza all suggest that. And of course, the fact that the door has been slammed in the face of Mike Pompeo, Nikki Haley, and other neocons suggests it too. And of course, if that is what happens, then that is completely consistent with what Donald Trump has been saying at various points in his campaign, and indeed before the campaign got underway. And it is also, and perhaps this is the most important thing to remember, it is also consistent with what Donald Trump's voting base has made clear that they want. Now, in a program that I did on the day when the election result came through, I expressed my own view that people who think that American voters are not interested in foreign policy and that this has no effect on their vote in an election are underestimating in the election that has just happened how concerned they have become about the deterioration in the international situation. And here I have to say most of what we've seen is anecdotal, but I've noticed that more and more commentators, more and more reporters who writing articles now, many of them, by the way, on the left, both in the United States and Britain, who have been out on the campaign, who have been talking to Trump voters, all come back and say that fear of war was repeatedly brought up by people intending to vote for Donald Trump as one of the reasons for voting for him. And that, of course, corresponds exactly with what I said, with the widespread concerns that the huge deterioration in the international situation has caused, and also with the experience that the American electorate has obtained as a result of the forever wars, that foreign policy is important, that policies that are conducive to wars are policies that American people are going to end up having to pay for. So I think that the conflict in Ukraine and the open-ended, indeed extraordinary commitment that some people within the administration and in the media wanted or want the United States to make in relation to it, I think that did play a role in persuading many Americans to vote for Donald Trump. They don't want that unlimited, unconstrained escalation. And Donald Trump, who has repeatedly shown that he is very in tune with the feelings of his supporters, understands that very well. And it is going to reflect increasingly the policies he's going to follow once he is indeed inaugurated President of the United States. So anyway, that's what we're getting from the administration. Another reason for thinking that the administration's policies are for real are the long and gloomy faces that took place, that we saw at the European Summit meeting, the meeting of the European Council that has just taken place in Budapest, the Hungarian capital, Budapest. It was very striking that the meeting, the council meeting, came up with no significant or important announcements. It was a very low-key meeting indeed. Robert Fico, who is the Prime Minister of Slovakia and who is an outspoken critic alongside the Hungarian Prime Minister Viktor Orban of European policy with respect to Ukraine, said that Zelensky, who was present at that meeting, was going around looking depressed and unhappy, that he was wearing, in other words, a long face. But it seems that he wasn't the only one. The European leaders altogether were also gloomy and depressed. Many of them have spoken to Donald Trump over the last 3 or 4 days since the election. Many of them, one senses, have tried to get Trump to disclose more about his intentions with respect to Ukraine and to try to get Donald Trump to make commitments about Ukraine that the Europeans can build on and try to capitalize on in order to constrain Trump's actions going forward. And all of them have failed to do so. Apparently, the Europeans spent a great deal of time talking to each other about this, and all of them discovered that whenever anybody has spoken to Donald Trump, whenever any of the European leaders have spoken to Donald Trump, they've all come back on the question of Ukraine with nothing at all. Zelensky, by the way, also found this to be the case. He too tried to talk to Donald Trump about what would happen with respect to Ukraine going forward. And though Trump has now learnt, or perhaps been coached, to be very polite and very friendly, he was careful to say nothing. Nothing that would pin him down in any way at all. The contrast, by the way, with the way in which Donald Trump acted in the transition period prior to the start of his first term is very striking. As I well remember at that time, in the last weeks of 2016 and first weeks of 2017, Trump was constantly making comments and providing assurances and saying all kinds of things, which ultimately, I think it's fair to say, worked against him. This time, he's learnt to be much, much more careful. And someone, I suspect, is coaching him about how to be friendly and polite and to say nothing. A political skill that all successful politicians need to learn. Just saying. Anyway, there we are. That's the situation with the Europeans, or at least those European leaders who want to continue the conflict with Ukraine. Now, they're all busy talking to each other. There's lots of talk about the need to increase military spending, to rely less on the United States. At this meeting in Budapest, predictably, Emmanuel Macron was talking a lot about this. He was coming forward and saying again what he always says, that the United States is not to be completely relied upon, that Europe must learn to stand on its own feet, that there must be more military spending, and Europe must work out its own foreign policies and do all of those things. I think, again, Europeans talking to each other in this way, talking about how they can go on supporting Ukraine by themselves, how they can build up their own militaries and their own foreign policy independently of the United States. The Europeans who talked to each other in that sort of way need to face some uncomfortable realities. The European Union has failed to develop a single successful social media company. Its attempts to forge ahead with any form of new technology have been completely unsuccessful. The mighty German car industry is in major crisis. It's certainly not succeeded in countering either the Americans or the Chinese in developing EVs. Whether you think that's a good thing or not, it doesn't really matter. Technologically, they've not been able to sort themselves out on this issue. Germany is almost certainly in recession, and it has been in a severe industrial recession. All European governments, to a greater or lesser degree, are facing significant budgetary problems and are under pressure either to raise taxes or to cut spending. And there are worries that if they don't, and if budget deficits continue to grow, then there could be problems for them in the financial markets. This following from the fact that three out of the big four European economies, Britain's, Italy's, and France's economy, all have a debt to GDP ratio of above 100%. Germany has a lower one at around 65%. But this has been largely the product, or so it seems to me, not just of Germany applying a fiscal brake, but of Germany being able to run big external surpluses. And that, in turn, has been very much the product of Germany's previous economic model, which relied on cheap energy imports from Russia, a strong export sector focused heavily on China, and other such things. That German economic model today looks broken, and already we can see stresses in the German budget, and sooner or later, I am sure the Germans are going to find that they're going to be forced, if things continue as they are, to do away with this constitutional debt brake. There will be no choice. And when they do, I predict that we're going to find debt levels in Germany rise very rapidly to the same sort of levels as those which we are seeing in Britain, France, and Italy, and also, by the way, the United States. There's been a really good article in the Financial Times by Martin Wolf, a commentator, by the way, with whom I disagree profoundly on international questions. But he's written a good article about the British economy. He points out that the reason that there are these enormous debt levels in Britain ultimately comes down to the fact that there is no economic growth. Because there is no economic growth, but because the British government has taken on multiple spending commitments, it is proving very, very difficult to keep the budgets in Britain under control, and the strain on those budgets is going to increase over time. That is, by the way, a very short summary of this article. Its title is "More Muddling Through Won't Deliver the Growth Britain Craves." The country needs a strategy that takes on its most obvious weaknesses, and he points out that in terms of economic policy, Britain has no economic strategy, and the same, by the way, applies pretty much everywhere else in Europe as well. And it's difficult to see how a policy can be arrived at that doesn't go against the fundamental orthodoxies. But in a period of such constraints in funding, the idea that European electorates are going to countenance the diversion of huge funds to a military build-up, which right across Europe, most European citizens are going to be deeply skeptical about and are not going to see the logic and purpose of, is a fantasy. People across Europe will not want to see health spending and education spending and social welfare spending and that kind of spending sacrificed to that goal. And they are not going to want to see taxes increased from their already very high level in order to fund that either. And of course, cutting spending and raising taxes, at least in the short term, probably even in the medium and long term too, is also going to undermine whatever remaining growth in the economy there still is. And frankly, it is not a good call for European governments. So all this talk about, increasing spending on defense, trying to engineer a kind of similar military build-up to the ones that we see in the United States and Russia, China, is a fantasy. It is not possible. If it were possible, almost 3 years now since the conflict in Ukraine began, it would have already happened. The urgency to do it has gone, and if it wasn't possible before, it's not realistically going to be possible now. So, without the United States' continued support for Ukraine on anything like the scale that we have seen over the last 3 years is simply not achievable. And that is something that European leaders need to understand, and higher defense spending to reach the level that would balance a reduction in the defense commitment to Europe of the United States, if it were withdrawn, is hardly achievable in today's Europe, and certainly not within any realistic, achievable time frame, such as would change the situation in Ukraine. Now, one person who I suspect deep down does probably understand that, at least at some level, is President Zelensky himself. Supposedly, he is trying to arrange another trip to the United States over the next few weeks to meet with President-elect Trump. Why he thinks he's going to get more commitments from Donald Trump over above those he didn't get when he last met Donald Trump in September, and when he spoke to Donald Trump on the telephone just a few days ago. Well, again, I don't know why Zelensky thinks that, but I suppose a desperate man, which is what he is, will clutch at straws. And as Robert Fico says, Zelensky is starting to look increasingly like a very desperate man. Now, the Hungarians and the Slovaks, the two skeptics about this whole Ukraine thing, are becoming increasingly confident and are looking more and more in the ascendant. Yesterday, I mentioned that Prime Minister Orban of Hungary, following the Budapest meeting, said that with the Americans basically looking like they are unlikely to go ahead with the loan, the $55 billion loan that was going to be repaid from the proceeds of the Russian assets, that ought logically to reopen the entire question of the loan in Europe as well. And of course, as I've also pointed out in recent programs, the recent political crisis in Germany, the one that has led to the breakdown in relations between Chancellor Scholz and his former finance minister Christian Lindner of the Free Democrats. That crisis, which has led to the collapse of the traffic light coalition and therefore ultimately of the current German government, that crisis was ultimately connected with these projects to provide funding via these loans to Ukraine. Christian Lindner is not prepared to relax the constitutional debt brake to allow Germany to meet its contributions under this loan, despite all of the promises that have been made by Ursula von der Leyen, one assumes by Annalena Baerbock, and no doubt by others, to Zelensky in Kiev. So, Orban on this is absolutely right. We've also had comments from Hungary's Foreign Minister, Peter Szijjártó. He says that Europe stands on the threshold of sweeping changes. The presidential election in the United States has changed the situation. It is obvious that the European strategy in respect of Ukraine, which has clearly failed, cannot be continued. And we go on to read that EU strategy is unsustainable because Trump intends to change the US approach to developments in Ukraine and Europe will not be able to support the Ukrainian army alone. And this is what Szijjártó went on to say. Trump has made it clear that he will endeavor to establish peace during his tenure as president. The European Union has no ability, either militarily or financially or economically, to take the place of the United States, assume earlier supplies of weapons from the United States and financial subsidies provided by the United States until now, and provide Ukraine with that on its own. We need a new strategy for the good of Europe so that problems of concern for us do not hang over our head. Szijjártó is absolutely right. The United States, for all its many problems, which are discussed every day at fantastic and extraordinary length on independent media and in all sorts of other places, and I'm not in any way discounting the fact that those problems do exist, but notwithstanding all of those problems, it remains a superpower. It still has a big military industrial complex, very powerful armed forces, a very active foreign policy, and financial resources that dwarf those of the European states, whether taken individually or collectively. If the United States pulls out of the Ukrainian project, then as Szijjártó and Orban, and by the way Fico as well, are all saying Europe cannot take the US's place, it would be a further cruel deception of the Ukrainians over and above all of the many other deceptions of the Ukrainians that we have consistently seen ever since the Orange Revolution of 2004, when the Ukrainians were basically promised EU entry, which, as we see, has receded ever further into the distance. It will be a further cruel deception of the Ukrainians to pretend to them that this European support for Ukraine, making up for the loss of support from the United States is possible. The time has come for the Europeans to face the realities of the limits on their own resources and to understand that without the United States, this game is lost, and to understand also that the United States is coming to this decision, or so it seems, to start to pull back, not from Ukraine, from this project Ukraine, not because one individual, Donald Trump, is acting as a spoiler. If you follow the debate that has been taking place in the United States for well over a year now, certainly since the failure of Ukraine's summer 2023 offensive, you can see that it is not just Donald Trump who's been raising doubts about all of this. Anyway, it is not just one individual, one eccentric individual who all European leaders can agree with each other that they don't like. It's not one individual who is causing US foreign policy, US policy on Ukraine to shift. It is the realities, the great power realities on the ground. Russia has proved a far more formidable adversary than anybody expected. Its economy has held up far better than anybody, either in the United States or Europe, and by the way, many people in Russia itself anticipated. Its industrial production figures have confounded everybody, especially in terms of its ability to keep on churning out weapon systems in quantities that no one in the West either could imagine or can hope to match. And of course, on the battlefronts, the Russians have shown that they have been able steadily to conduct attrition against the Ukrainians, to win the proxy war that the United States has successfully tried to impose on the Russians through Ukraine, and to wrest the initiative from the West and from the Ukrainians, and to move forward to win the war, as it is already, as I've said in previous programs, effectively done. So that is the reality that the United States as a great power, as a superpower, has to face. And this United States also has to face other realities as well. It has to face the fact that there is a massive crisis in the Middle East, which is unresolved, and which is also quite plausibly going to be a further demand on US resources. And the United States also faces the fact that it is looking at other potential crises with China in East Asia, with North Korea in the Korean Peninsula, and these potentially will also draw on American resources as well. It is because of this accumulated resource problem, the drain on US resources, the effect that this is causing on the understanding of foreign policy of the US electorate, the stresses on the US economy that this over-ambitious and over-expansive foreign policy that has been followed at the urging of the neocons has led to, with all the problems it's caused for ordinary Americans in the United States. It is the product of all of these things that has brought about the rise of Donald Trump, and which in great measure explains his victory. And that is not, of course, to discount his own significance, his own personal significance as well. So, if the Americans can't do this, and if the Europeans can't do this, What is the logical thing to do? Surely it is to seek peace. Now, I'm going to return briefly to that article that I discussed for a short time in the London Times yesterday by the British commentator and historian Max Hastings. And he says some very remarkable things about the supporters in Britain and in Europe, the supporters of unlimited and total support for Ukraine. He says this, some of us who are unwavering supporters of Ukraine have been exasperated by conservative big mouths. I don't know why he talks about conservative big mouths. Many Labour people have been at least as big mouths on this as any conservative. Anyway, have been exasperated by conservative big mouths who since 2022 have predicted Russia's collapse. I have never met a responsible soldier on either side of the Atlantic who supposed that Ukraine could achieve an absolute win over this vastly bigger nation, he means Russia, whatever weapons we give them. Well, I have to say, I'm a little surprised by that because I've listened to many military people, both in the United States and in Britain, who have spoken about Ukraine winning its war, achieving an absolute win over Russia. David Petraeus, Ben Hodges, General Breedlove in the United States, our old friends in Britain, Hamish de Bretton Gordon, Richard Kemp, they've also spoken in these terms as well. Maybe Max Hastings is not paying much attention to them because he doesn't consider them responsible soldiers. About which, by the way, I would agree with him. But anyway, when he says that he's never met a responsible soldier on either side of the Atlantic who supposed that Ukraine could achieve an absolute win over this vastly bigger nation, then one should be very clear that there were plenty of soldiers who were not responsible, both in the United States and in Britain, who did, in fact, predict that very thing. But then Max Hastings goes on to say, this is why I predicted that the war would end in a dirty deal, and why, very unhappily, I still expect that. Ukraine is now in much the position of Finland in March 1940, almost on the ropes, after heroic resistance to Soviet aggression. Instead of blaming Trump, we should consider what should matter most to Ukrainians and to all lovers of freedom if and when there is an apprentice-driven negotiation. Now, I don't like any of this language. I don't like the tone of those comments. But what Max Hastings is basically saying is that the Russians are going to win the war. We need to accept that fact. There was never any prospect that the Russians would lose. And we've now reached the point when some sort of negotiation with the Russians is inevitable, and the right thing for us to do is to try to negotiate for better terms. Now, maybe he did predict that, but I do read Max Hastings regularly, and I can't say that he predicted that very forthrightly. Even in this article in the London Times, it seems to me that his language is all wrong. Contrast this language about being very unhappy and talking about Putin. He says all sorts of terrible things about Putin over the course of this article. Contrast that with the forthright and clear way in which, say, Lord Skidelsky has been a consistent advocate for negotiation with the Russians, basically ever since the conflict started. Max Hastings is somebody people do listen to in Britain, and it seems to me that he needed to be taken, if he did have these views, if he never believed, as he now says, that Ukraine could win, he needed to say that much more clearly and far more forthrightly than he did, and he needed to say it with the same consistency and courage that Lord Skidelsky, amongst others, has shown. But anyway, there we go. Some people in Britain perhaps do get it, that we need to negotiate, we need to start looking for a way out. He goes on to say that there's a risk that the Russians will come away feeling stronger, even stronger than perhaps we are, and that this is going to be a difficult peace to negotiate. He accepts that the Russians, who feel very much in the ascendant, have little reason to compromise, but he does seem to be edging towards understanding that negotiations are going to be necessary. Well, let's hope so. Let's hope that there is that understanding, because, to repeat once again, the discussions that took place just now in Budapest, the discussions that seem to be taking place in London within the British political class, don't even seem to reflect this grudging acceptance of the realities that Max Hastings is talking about in this article. Anyway, let's see what happens. But let's also remember the facts, the military facts on the ground in Ukraine. And I touched a little on the military situation yesterday, and I'm going to say that today we've had more reports of more military action taking place across Ukraine, and it points to a further military deterioration. Now, the Ukrainians over the last 24 hours conducted the biggest drone attack on Moscow that they have ever attempted. It was apparently on a huge scale, and it was unsuccessful. The Ukrainians, for all the attempts that they did to send large numbers of drones, according to the Russians, they failed to achieve anything. The vast majority of the drones failed to hit their targets. That doesn't mean that none of the drones hit their targets, but in terms of Russia, the drone attack was a failure and was effectively a pinprick. An article in The Guardian, strangely enough, at the very end, in its very final paragraph, acknowledges the fact there was no sign of panic on Moscow's boulevards after the drone attack, agencies reported on Sunday. Muscovites walked their dogs, and the bells of the onion-domed Russian Orthodox churches rang out across the capital. Ukraine launched its biggest ever drone attack on Russia, and Russia shrugged. The drones failed to get through. The country went about its life as normal. Russia continues to grow stronger in this war every day. And drone attacks, which a year ago would have been a problem, the Russian air defense system has evolved to that point that it has little difficulty in countering them. By contrast, Russian drone attacks and missile attacks on Ukraine happen all the time. The latest Ukrainian drone attack is justified or explained by the Ukrainians as having been conducted in response to a Russian drone attack on Kiev on Thursday. The Russian drone attack on Kiev did significant damage. The Ukrainian drone attack on Moscow appears to have done none, or none at least of any real significance. Now, there's been a lot of talk recently about various moves by the Ukrainians and the Russians to talk, to conduct discussions on a cessation of drone attacks or missile attacks on each other's energy systems. And the interesting thing is that the Russians have consistently denied that such talks are taking place, that the reports that appeared a short time ago in the Financial Times, for example, say that the reports that were circulating in the Financial Times that Qatar was brokering negotiations of that kind. Well, it turns out, what the Russians said, that nothing like that was actually happening. Now, a couple of programs ago, I said that the Ukrainians, that Zelensky himself, appeared to be denying that such talks were underway, and we've now had an authoritative denial of the fact of such talks from Zelensky's own chief of staff, Andrei Yermak. And he gave an interview, Yermak gave an interview about this. I'm going to read from a summary of this interview, which I found on Simplicius the Thinker's latest blog piece. Yermak finally explained what Ukraine means when they talk about an agreement with Russia against ending attacks on the energy sector. These negotiations, the way they write about them, that these are supposedly negotiations between Ukraine and Russia, this is definitely not true. What is actually happening, we held themed conferences. The first conference was about energy security. It was online, but Qatar was the co-organizer. And when this conference took place, we recorded the principles on this point of the peace formula. All these themed conferences are held without Russia. After that, we said that if today, for example, Qatar or another country is ready to implement these agreements through agreements with Ukraine separately, and for example, separately with the Russian Federation, they are welcome to. So that is a very complicated way for Yermak to say that there are in fact no talks of any kind going on between the Ukrainians and the Russians, whether it be about a cessation of mutual strikes on each other's energy system or any other matter. The Ukrainians are conducting discussions in working parties with themselves and their friends. Qatar has acted as a kind of co-host. So these discussions have happened online. The Russians are not involved in any way. And yet this has all been spun by someone to the Financial Times as some kind of negotiation taking place between the Ukrainians and the Russians. As we have just seen over the last couple of days, with the Russian drone attack on Kiev on Thursday and this latest Ukrainian drone strike on Moscow, no negotiations on any one of these topics are taking place. there are no negotiations, substantive negotiations taking place between the Russians and the Ukrainians on any issue. If you read articles or pieces in the media that imply that they are, just remember this incident and the way in which this has been shown to be untrue, and be very, very careful before you assume that such negotiations are indeed taking place. So, massive missile strikes by the Russians against the Ukrainians, doing huge damage, missile and drone strikes. Attempts by Ukraine to reciprocate with big drone strikes against Russia, and those drone strikes completely unsuccessful. So the war in the air remains heavily balanced. It's tilting steadily in Russia's favor. The Biden administration, in the last few weeks in which it is still in office, is attempting apparently to rush as many air defense interceptors as it can to Ukraine before it leaves. There's talk of up to 500 air defense interceptors, some of them Patriots, some of them from the NASAM systems, some of them for other systems being sent to Ukraine over the next few weeks, which is a huge number of air defense systems, significantly depleting American arsenals. But on the record of what has happened, those missile interceptors will be run through by Ukraine very fast. 500 interceptors is not going to change the situation on the battlefronts to any degree. And of course, it's not just missile interceptors that Ukraine is now running short of. It is also running short of air defense missile launchers. The Russians have been successfully destroying more and more of these. And as their forces get stronger, they will be able to destroy even more. The Pentagon, in the meantime, according to a report I saw, has categorically ruled out prioritizing Ukraine for more ATACMS missile deliveries above other US allies who are also customers for these missiles. And I discussed yesterday in my program how the Ukrainians are becoming deeply angered by the inability, it's not the refusal, it is the inability of the British to supply Storm Shadows as well. So air defense missiles, Ukraine is going to get a further batch, probably angering Donald Trump when he finds out about it, by the way, and his defense secretary when he or she finds out about it also. But a refusal to supply more long-range missiles. And on the ground, even as the United States, even as the Biden administration tries to send to Ukraine whatever it still can, the priority, by the way, being clearly to prevent a Ukrainian collapse before Trump's inauguration, while Biden is still president. Even whilst that is still going on, the Russians continue to advance. And the last couple of hours have seen more dramatic advances by the Russians, especially in southwest Ukraine. It is, in fact, as I've said previously, becoming very difficult to keep up with the scale, the speed of the Russian advance. So firstly, there was recently a lot of talk about the Russians advancing from Novodimitrivka, capturing a village called Zorya. This is all in the area of Selidovo in southwest Donbass, and supposedly coming up against the defenses of another village called Sonsivka, which Radovka said the Ukrainians had heavily fortified, and that Sonsivka would be a difficult nut for the Russians to crack, except the latest reports, and these are not just reports, apparently they're based on film and photographic evidence. The latest reports suggest that the Russians are close to cracking this nut. Just a few days after Radovka published that piece, because the Russians have entered Sonsivka. There is film showing the Ukrainians fighting Russian troops inside Sonsivka itself. The Russians, at the very least, control some buildings in the northeastern part of this village. I don't know how big the village is, but all the indications are that the village will fall under Russian control fairly soon. Opening up the way, by the way, for the Russians to advance towards Andreevka on Konstantinopol and Dachny, the villages that lie to the west of Kurakhovo along the main road, the only exit road that the Ukrainian army can use if it does choose to withdraw from Kurakhovo. Anyway, from Sonsevka, reaching these villages, Dachny, Andreevka, Konstantinopol, the distances start to look quite small. And of course, bear in mind that the Russians are also located immediately to the south of these villages also. They controlled Shakhtarske and Maximovka and Bogoyavlenka and Novoyukrainka, all of them just south of these villages too, these villages to the west of Kurakhovo. And it looks as if the pincers that are closing in on these villages from the north and the south, threatening the creation of a major cauldron of the Ukrainian troops in Kurakhovo. The pincers are advancing ever faster. The Ukrainians don't seem to have any means to withstand them or to slow them down. And in Kurakhovo itself, we're getting lots of reports that the Russians are storming through the town. Now, this is very difficult to get much sense of, and I have to say, I am frankly surprised by these reports. I would have thought that it would take I was expecting the Russians to start an attack on Kurakhovo, not over the last couple of days, but perhaps in a week or so's time. But the latest reports strongly suggest that the Russians are now in control of eastern Kurakhovo, that they reached the central area of Kurakhovo, that they are in fact pushing the Ukrainians towards the western section of Kurakhovo, even as I said, as the pincers around Kurakhovo from the south and from the north close in. If the village of Sonsevka falls, and there are some claims today that Sonsevka has already fallen, that this strongly fortified village has already been captured by the Russians. I want to stress these are not confirmed reports, they are rumors. But if this is true, then it seems to me that the entire Kurakhovo front of the Ukrainian army is not collapsing, it has collapsed. And a total encirclement of the Ukrainian troops in Kurakhovo itself and in the territory around it is now, in effect, already achieved. I want to stress again, I'm not saying that Sonsevka has fallen. I'm not saying that the Russians have reached the central areas of Kurakhovo, but that they do seem to be in Sonsevka itself, That, as I said, has been confirmed by film. And the reports that they're pushing through Kurakhovo are starting to look very detailed and probably true as well. The Russian Defense Ministry, by the way, for the record, has this morning announced that Vovchenka, the village to the northwest of Kurakhovo, on the northern bank of the Kurakhovo reservoir, has come under complete Russian control. In fact, it's likely that the Russians have already moved well to the west of that village, that Stepanova, another village west of Vovchenka, has fallen. It's plausible that the Russians have already captured another village called Ilinka to the west of that village, in which case the Russians will be within days or perhaps even hours of complete control of the entire northern bank of the Kurakhovo reservoir, directly opposite Kurakhovo itself. We have become so accustomed in this war to slow, gradual, incremental advances by the Russian army that these very rapid movements, which is what they are, and they are becoming more rapid by the day, are something that I think many people in the West simply are struggling to understand. Now, I ought to say that the focus at the moment in this area is on Kurakhovo and the area around it. There was a lot of talk a couple of weeks ago about heavy fighting around a coal mine and a slag heap east of the town of Novogrodivka, a little to the north, which the Russians captured back in August. It seems that that coal mine and slag heap are now fully under Russian control. It was confirmed many weeks ago that the Russian troops have entered a village called Lisivka to the southwest of Pokrovsk. Who knows what is happening in all of these places? And of course, as I discussed in my program yesterday, all the indications are that General Teplinsky and his men of the group of forces Dnieper in Zaporozhye region are preparing some major offensive towards perhaps Zaporozhye city via Orechov and Malaya Tokmachka. I'd like to thank the person who wrote to me about the correct pronunciation of that village. Anyway, it looks as if the Russians are preparing some moves there as well. And everywhere else, the situation continues to get worse. Now, there's been more visual confirmation, apparently, of further Russian advances in Toretsk. This is, as I said, still more attritional, incremental warfare in central Donbass. The Ukrainians, in my opinion, have overinvested in the defense of Toretsk. But anyway, for whatever reason, they've tried to slow down the Russians there. They counterattacked, according to Redovka, recently in Toretsk. That counterattack has run out of steam, and the Russians are back on the attack again. Anyway, there's been more Russian advances in Toretsk. There is a lot of news of significant Russian advances in Chasiv Yar, and a recent report from the Russians provided a detailed account of 3 prongs to the Russian attack in the north and center of Chasiv Yar. The 98th Airborne Division is leading the attack in the central area of Chasiv Yar. There are 2 further units, Russian units, which are advancing towards the northern, through the northern sections of Chasiv Yar. The Russians acknowledge bitter Ukrainian resistance, tough Ukrainian resistance in central Chasiv Yar, in an industrial area in central Chasiv Yar. But they are saying that they are now advancing, and it looks as if the Russians could be preparing for a last major attack on these positions in central Chasiv Yar. Now, these are the advances that are taking place in Chasiv Yar. From the center, from the east and the north, we've not been provided with recent information about the very sweeping Russian advances that have been taking place from the south, which look like they're intended to cut off the supply roads. It is a difficult battle, clearly, but again, the trajectory of travel is clear, and the Ukrainians have put up a fierce defense in Chasiv Yar, but it's gradually coming to an end. And of course, there's continued reports, many reports about what's going on in the Kupiansk area, in the Oskol and Zherebets rivers. I get to skip those. Further Russian advances on the banks of those rivers, but it's all very detailed, and I'm not going to devote time to it. But in Kursk region, group of forces north have told us that the Russian advance, latest Russian attack, which captured 12 kilometers on its first day and 2 kilometers on its second day, has now advanced by a further 4 kilometers on the third day. Where all of these advances are taking place, I confess I'm not really sure. There were reports this morning that a village called Pagrekki in the north area of the Kursk pocket has now been recaptured by the Russians, liberated as they would say. The Kursk pocket is being reduced in size. I think that the Russians are playing a cat and mouse game with the Ukrainians in the Kursk pocket. They're gradually shrinking it without making a serious effort to extinguish it in one blow, because they want the Ukrainians to continue to reinforce the Kursk pocket, because that is the most effective way of attritioning the best Ukrainian forces on the northern section of the front line, where very plausibly the Russians will conduct their own offensive towards Kiev in the winter. So all of this is going on, and we have all of these discussions in Europe, people talking about negotiations but not being prepared to negotiate, fantasizing about military build-ups and increasing defense spending, which they're not going to be able to do. The Hungarians rightly pointing out the absurdity of these plans, and it's important to say that they are absurd. These plans are not just fantastic and wrong, they are actually absurd, and agonizing about beginning negotiations with the Russians. The Europeans unable to do that, even those who intellectually, like Max Hastings, seem to have acknowledged the necessity of doing this, making it absolutely clear that that is the very, very last thing they want to do, and that they still find it impossible to conduct negotiations in any realistic way. Whilst in the meantime, Zelensky digs himself in. He continues to refuse any negotiations at all. The trial balloon of talks on a mutual cessation of attacks on the energy system is now exposed for what it is, a trial balloon with nothing but hot air inside it. There was never any truth to that story. And not that I've seen any retraction, by the way, from the Financial Times, or expect to, despite what Yermak and before him Zelensky have just said. Donald Trump picking his transition team and perhaps sending out signals through various people that he's not going to let his administration get trapped into another proxy war forever, another forever war, proxy war with the Russians in Ukraine. And the Russians, for their part, watching and waiting to see what Donald Trump is going to do, waiting to see what the Europeans might do. But in the meantime, going on with the business of winning the war. Well, that's where I finish my program today. More from me soon. Let me remind you again that you can find all our programs on our various platforms, Locals, Rumble and X. You can support our work via Patreon and Subscribestar and by going to our shop, links under this video. And last but not least, if you've liked this program, please remember to tick the like button and to check your subscription to this channel. We're going to see, it seems to me, over the next few hours, we're going to get a little more clarity as the Trump transition team begins to cohere. My own sense is that where Ukraine is concerned, we are now in the last act of this long and difficult play. But who knows? There might still be some twists and turns, and much will depend on how quickly this ends or what decisions now are made in the United States. But in the meantime, this is where I finish my program. More from me tomorrow. Until then, all that remains is for me to wish you a very good day.